Well, hello. I'm not going to thank anybody yet. I'm going to do it at the end. My name is Kate Mosse. I'm a novelist, a playwright, a non-fiction writer. But I stand here tonight not just as an author, but here as a reader to speak up for why this collaboration, this celebration of European literature is so important. And also as a former publisher who did a certain amount of publishing of translated fiction in the days when everybody said that nobody bought translated fiction. Boy, have things changed. But have they changed enough? Probably not. So, when I was looking for inspiration about what to say, I said, what do you want me to do tonight? They said, firstly, we would like you to be the English writer. And they said, secondly, just any thoughts that you have. Now, that is a terribly large brief, because I have many thoughts, and most of them are not printable or indeed shareable in public. But it did make me think about all the ways in which all of us engage with writing, how we first engage with writing, and what it means to have one language that you can write in or speak in, listen in, what it means to have more, and how those of us who are relatively limited in our language, in that we speak maybe only one or two or maybe three languages, how much we miss without the incredible efforts of the publishers, the translators, the agents in all the countries, but particularly here tonight, who make sure that we get the opportunity to share voices that would otherwise be closed to us. So before we go on, I would like just for everybody to applaud everybody in this room, the translators in particular, but the publishers and agents who bring so much amazing European literature to this country. Yeah. So the English poet Shelley wrote this in 1821 in his famous essay, A Defence of Poetry. Poets are not only the authors of language and of music, of the dance and architecture and statuary and painting, they are the institutors of law and the founders of civil society. And he goes on to probably say his most quoted, most famous line in A Defence of Poetry, which is this: poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. Now, if we take away the word poet, forgive me, poets in the audience, and we put the word writer, it's what brings us all here tonight. And I wanted to say, although it's vulgar to be political in an evening that is about celebration, that we do stand at the moment in Europe in perilous times. There are many, for whatever reason, who would like to emphasize the things that separate us, whether we are men or women, whether we are white, black, whatever color that we define ourselves, whatever ethnicity we are, wherever we were born, whatever language we speak, whatever religion we follow or none. People who have been neighbors for years are being, if you like, portrayed by the people who are not in the media so much, but our leaders, the politicians, the legislators sometimes, to see ourselves only as people in conflict, rather than the fact that we are all Europeans. We all have connections and love and long, long shared common histories and goals and stories that go all the way back to the earliest words written, whether it be on a slate, on a piece of wood, finally on a piece of paper. And we stand here in England, particularly today, that is a country that is built on other people and built on translation. Because almost everything that is the fundamental building blocks, if you will, of this country, you could say, comes from the nature of translation. Take just two: the Magna Carta, written in Latin, not translated into English into the middle of the 16th century, or the King James Bible, which of course was a translation of a translation of a translation, finally in English in 1611. So all of us here, wherever we come from, have grown up with the sense of other voices, other languages in our head, but sometimes we forget that. And I was reminded of the American author, just one American I'm going to sneak in tonight, the great lesbian feminist civil rights poet Adrienne Rich, who wrote many works about the power of words, but particularly one collection in the 70s called The Dream of a Common Language. And she didn't mean that everybody should speak the same language or read the same language, but that we should celebrate every language to draw the fact together that the way that we feel is the same. Our hearts beat the same, regardless of the words that come out of our mouths or the things that we hear in our head. And of course, the word translate comes from the Latin to mean to carry across, to bear across. And one of the best, I suppose, definitions I've ever read of what it means to be a translator is in the Orange Prize winning book by Anne Michaels, Fugitive Pieces, which is a beautiful novel which starts in Poland. It moves to Greece, and then it goes to Canada with the Jewish diaspora after the Second World War. And Anne wrote this: "The writer moves from life to language. The translator moves from language to life. Both, like the immigrant, try to identify the invisible, what's between the lines, the mysterious implications." And I love the idea of the mysterious implications, of the gaps, the things that we do understand and that we misunderstand sometimes between us. Standing as a writer with my writer hat on, I started to think very closely about what it meant to be translated when I had a book called Labyrinth and a sequence of books all inspired by the history of the southwest of France, even though I'm an Englishwoman writing in English. And I started to be translated, and I went to every country that I could that invited me. And I learnt two things. The first thing I learnt was, and that's why I did want to thank the translators here, that is a bit hit and miss. Sometimes you realise that the translation of your book is not entirely the book that you think you wrote. So there is one country that I will not say what the language was, because that also would be not gallant. But I sat there waiting to talk about my book, which is about faith and the consequences of faith, war and the consequences of war, Christianity, a particular form of so-deemed heretical Christianity in France at the beginning of the 13th century. And every journalist came in, and after they had introduced themselves and their paper, would say, "So you have written a love story?" And I would think, well, there is a Duchess of Malfi Hamlet body count in this, but if that is your idea of love, well, so be it. And as I went round, I learnt more and more, and I remember very clearly being in Sozopol in Bulgaria, talking to a range of other writers, and suddenly understanding that this was what I was missing. Not just that I didn't know many of the authors that I was sitting next to, but their stories, when I talked to them, were shut to me because I could not read that language the books had been written in. And I came back from those trips thinking, more must be translated in all the languages so that we can continue to think about what connects us, what makes us human, what makes us the people we would like to be. What makes us, as Shelley was saying, the people as writers and readers who support writers who can change the world, who can change the narrative of the way that sometimes it goes. So the other thing, I suppose, that I realised when I was coming back from these trips was that we did have a very narrow idea of what it is to read fiction that was written in a language other than our own. And for me, I started to think of the books that mattered to me that I had read in English but had not been written in English. And of course, I realised, as so often you do, that they are, in inverted commas, although also this is true, classics. And when something is a classic, it has already become safe. So, of course, we celebrate Flaubert. Whether you like Emma Bovary or think she's a bit annoying, that doesn't matter. You celebrate Bulgakov, obviously Master and Margarita, whatever it is. You remember the things that many writers have gone through, have been denied, in order just to be allowed to speak. But nonetheless, you realise that the books that we think of often as great European literature are classics. Now, what is so important about this festival, which started on one night and is now a festival with so many writers, is that this is how modern classics are made. This is how we learn who, and we are going to hear from 6 exceptional writers who many of you will know and many of you will not. But they should be, and they are, in their own countries and their own written languages, household names. But these are the classics that in 20 years' time, people like me and our children should be talking about. Because don't ever forget that it is dangerous to talk and write in your own language. It's not just about giving in to the idea that there is a universal language. Us in England have been lucky, not because we had Shakespeare, although that was bloody lucky, but because of the internet. The internet changed the way that people were connecting in that way. And with the Women's Prize for Fiction, which we set up 21 years ago, to begin with, there was nobody writing in English who was not from a country where English was one of the dominant languages. Now, 21 years later, many of the writers we receive the books from have chosen to write in English rather than their own language. And I think this festival says that it is important that we celebrate all the languages and remember that in the 13th century in France, in the period that I write about, if you were found holding a copy of the New Testament in your own language, Occitan, you would be punished by death. Remember that in France, again, in the middle of the 16th century, if you were found with a copy of Marot's translation of the Psalms into French, you would be punished by death. There are writers all over the world who, for writing what they think and in their own languages, are put into prison and suffer a lack of ability to be able to publish or write. Many places all over the world, we know this. And so it matters a great deal that we celebrate. It matters tonight that we are showcasing 6 exceptional writers. I feel honoured to be sharing a stage with you. Every time now I go on a trip, when I get to a bookshop in whatever country, in Amsterdam, in Bruges, in Istanbul, in Bulgaria, in Sofia usually, that I've been, wherever it is that I've been, I say to the bookshop owner, please give me a book from someone writing here, writing now, because I want to know the classics that will be, not just the ones that we were all brought up to read. So I'm just going to finish with 2 sentences from writers who are not represented here this evening, partly because they are both dead, but also because they are French and Spanish, and I felt it would be inelegant to quote any writers from the countries we're about to hear from. And I suppose that one of them is the great Spanish writer Cervantes, mid-16th century. Too much sanity may be madness, and the maddest of all is to see life as it is and not as it should be. And that is what writers try to do, to see what should be, not what just is. And I will give the final word to another indomitable woman, not dressed in red, as your host for this evening, Rosie, is, but red in spirit, tooth and claw, Simone de Beauvoir. And she said this: on paper, I make time stand still and impose my convictions on the world. They become the reality. The one thing we can all do as readers is buy the books of the authors that are being published now. And that is the best way to honour any writer. And so I will be lurking out there. And if I don't not see all of you with every 6 of these books, next time I'm giving this speech, I shall name you and shame you. No, seriously, thank you very much for having me here. A great, great celebration. An enormous congratulations to Rosie Goldsmith, to everybody here at the British Library. But most of all, it's my great pleasure to give the stage over to the writers. Thank you.